the Boundless Authenticity podcast. Thanks for tuning in to the Boundless Authenticity podcast. Today, I'm joined by David J. Roberts, who became a parent who experienced the death of a child when his daughter Jeannine died of cancer on March 1st, 2003, at the age of 18. He is a retired addiction professional and an adjunct professor in the Psychology Child Life Department at Utica University in Utica, New York. Dave also teaches psychology classes at Pratt Munson School of Art and Design. He is the host of the Teaching Journeys podcast, which can be found on most podcast platforms. Dave has presented workshops at national conferences of the Compassionate Friends, as well as for the bereaved parents of the USA. He was also a keynote speaker at the 2011 and 2015 national gatherings of the bereaved parents of the USA. Dave also co-presented a workshop titled Helping Faculty After Traumatic Loss for the Parkland, Florida community in May of 2018 in the aftermath of the mass shootings at Stoneman Douglas High School. Dave has been a past HuffPost contributor and has contributed articles to Medium, Open to Hope Foundation, Mindfulness and Grief Thrive Global, and the Recovering the Self Journal. He has also appeared on numerous podcasts, as well as Open to Hope Television. He co-authored a book with Reverend Patty Farino titled When the Psychology Professor Met the Minister, which was published on March 1st, 2021. So I'm going to start today's podcast with a quote that I found on Dave's website, and it goes like this. Sorrow makes us all children again, destroys all differences of intellect. The wisest know nothing. Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Dave, how's it going?
Jeannine, it's going very well. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. I've been looking forward to our conversation for some time now.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. This will be the third time that we're talking. And I have to say, I've really taken a liking to you, Dave. So you might be a permanent fixture here on the podcast.
That's not a bad thing, particularly as I get older. The more permanent fixtures I can be anywhere, the better off I am. So I'm grateful for any type of permanent fixture offering I can be to anybody at this point. So
great. So Dave, if you could just expand on some of the things that we read about you in your biography, that would be good.
Well, there's a couple of things that I can expand on. First of all, the life that I am leading now, the path that I am walking now is never a path I ever thought I'd be walking. No parent, I think, ever comes on earth anticipating that they're going to bury one of their children. We all always believe that our children are going to carry our legacy as opposed to us carrying our children's legacy. But my life started out very literally, very predictably. I graduated from Utica University in 1977, had a couple of different jobs, and then found my calling in the addictions field. In 1986, I was hired at the McPike Addiction Treatment Center, a state-run facility in Utica, New York. I was there for 27 years, and I retired in 2012. At about 17 years into my career as an addictions professional, I was hired as an adjunct, at the time, an adjunct lecturer at Utica University, and I'm now an adjunct professor, and I've been there for 21 years. But in between all of that came some very, very dark times in my life. And I want to give, Jeannine, you and your listeners, 3 specific dates that are sort of the centerpiece of my story and how I've embraced the path that I'm on, and also to show you how life can kind of just turn on a dime. May 2nd, my daughter Jeannine's first and only daughter, Brianna, was born. May 2nd, 2002. Brianna is now 22 years old, and she has 2 children of her own, so I am now a great-grandfather. On May 19th, a 25-year journey to obtain my master's in social work degree ended when I officially got conferred my degree on May 19th, 2002 from the State University of New York at Albany. And on May 26th, my daughter was diagnosed with a malignant tumor in her foot, cancerous tumor in her foot. That diagnosis was confirmed June 2nd by the Dana-Farber Research Hospital, Research Center and Hospital in Boston, where I was told that she had a rare form of cancer called alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, which is a connective muscle tissue cancer that the primary site was her right foot that she had injured in a freak accident during pregnancy. Traditional interventions to deal with the swollen foot did not work. Every one of us in our family thought that it was her swelled foot was simply some complications from pregnancy, but it turned out that that injury activated some dormant cancer cells, and pregnancy masked the diagnosis, and she was diagnosed with a stage 4 tumor. We were told in Boston that with bone marrow and lymph node involvement, and we were told that her cancer was incurable, that the only cure we were going to have, or chance we were going to have for a cure, is if her cancer was put into remission until a cure could be found. So what I heard, and my daughter heard, and I think her significant other and my wife, Sherry, heard, was that unless there's a miracle, your daughter's going to die. So I went from the exhilaration of being a grandfather to the contentment of attaining an educational goal 25 years in the making, to now being an unwitting participant and a caregiver to a daughter who was now terminally ill and in all likelihood was going to die. And 10 months after she was diagnosed, even after 6 rounds of chemotherapy, which did not put her cancer in total remission, she died, or as I now call it, transitioned from the physical world to the spiritual world. And that set me off on a path that all the training in the world, all the therapy that I did with clients who had their own traumas due to addiction and not due to addiction, none of that began to even prepare me for the path that I was about to walk. I was a 47-year-old man who was now living in a world that was totally alien and very terrifying. Trying to think moving forward, how am I going to live in a world where my only daughter is not present? And I do have 2 other sons, one older than my daughter Jeannine and one younger. And I'm both very, very proud of them. They're great kids. They're great young men. They've got their own families. They've got their own careers, and they've been very successful in their own right. But my world stopped. My world stopped when my daughter transitioned, and so that kind of gives you and the listeners some additional context to what's going on.
Yeah, that gives a tremendous amount of context. Do you think that there is anything that could have happened that would ever have been able to prepare you for that kind of loss?
No. I never even had allowed myself to even go there. I never allowed myself to even visualize what it would be like without one of my children physically present. And I was what a friend of mine would call one of those fortunate others. I would read accounts of parents who had lost a child, and my heart would go out to them, but simultaneously I was glad it wasn't me. But then it became me, and my whole perspective shifted. Every time now that I saw a parent, I read about a parent in the paper, his child had died, the amount of empathy and compassion and shared pain that I had for a person that I did not even know, but yet we were bound together by the unthinkable, changed. And I think one of the things that's happened over the 21 years is that my compassion has grown not only to people that I know, not only to my students or to other people that are in my life, but to people that I don't even know, who've experienced life-altering loss, and particularly that involving the death of a child, because I can say I know what it's like. Unfortunately, I can say I know what it's like.
Well, let's get into understanding a bit about grief. Could you explain what grief is and how it can manifest differently in people?
Well, first of all, with any loss, there are consistent changes that occur physically, psychologically, cognitively, and socially. And I have found that to be consistent with those individuals that I have companioned after loss. Things like inability to sleep, fatigue beyond fatigue, um, compromised immune systems due to the excessive stress of grief. Talk about release of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, an inability to sleep probably 6 months after the death of a child. Disorientation, disorganization, confusion, obsessive rumination, which is playing over and over the last day of that person's life, regardless of cause of death. And it isn't, obsessive rumination isn't indicative of a mental illness. It's our mind, it's our bodies, and our soul's desire to make sense out of what happened. So we replay that story over and over and over again until we can come to terms with it and accept what has happened. Acceptance does not mean closure. Acceptance means that I can accept that I am now living in a world where my loved ones are not physically present, but I am committed to service. I am committed to re-engaging in life with purpose, with passion, in spite of what's happened. Socially, relationships change, and I tell people expect that they're going to change. The people that you thought were going to step up don't step up. The people that you never expected to step up do step up. But what a lot of times in early grief, and I can speak for myself, and I've also talked to others, what we ruminate over are the people that aren't there when we need to be grateful for the people that are. Many individuals I have discovered did not know how to handle my grief. They did not know how to approach me. They were afraid that if they mentioned my daughter's name, they were going to upset me. Little did they know that I was already upset, and mentioning her name would have been of great comfort to me. And there are other things. Physically, we are under a tremendous amount of stress, particularly within that first 24 hours to a week, where we're susceptible to heart attack, we're susceptible to stroke, just because of the elevated levels of stress, but we're particularly susceptible within that time period. So, and those conditions, those characteristics of grief will happen with every loss. Just because I've come to accept and come to peace with the terms of my daughter's loss doesn't mean that I can take that, bank that, and automatically apply that on any other losses that I have and will experience. I will go through that same process with each and every loss. And it's a process that needs to be gone through. It's a process that needs to be expected. And more so, it's a process that needs to be honored.
What are some things that someone can do to overcome the obsessive rumination?
I think one, particularly the obsessive rumination, is going to occur, I think throughout particularly early grief, but particularly becomes more prominent as we get closer to specific milestone dates, such as the date of that person's death or transition or passing, birthdays, any other significant milestone events that could have involved that individual, like a wedding of a friend, a wedding of another sibling in that family. So what I encourage individuals to do is, one, prepare for that. Understand that the obsessive rumination is going to probably become more intense. And it's at that moment that to find some support with individuals who are willing to hear where you're at, to hear your particular story, which is going to continue to evolve each year that you grieve, and they're just going to be willing to hold space for whatever you need to talk about, and you need to come to terms with, particularly in those last moments or the last day of that person's life. So it's about finding support. I think it's also about trying to read as much literature as you can on grief and memoirs of individuals who have experience the same type of loss to find out what they did to get through that, how they handled the obsessive rumination, how they handled the anticipation leading up to specific milestone dates. I found all of that to be specifically helpful for me, as well as finding a really good support group that could align with the specific loss that I had.
What are some common misconceptions about grief that maybe you experienced or that other people have experienced?
Well, one is that one of the common misconceptions is that grief is linear and that it's time limited. And I think, Jeannine, this all started when Kubler-Ross came out, I think in 1969, with the stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came out with the stages of grief to give individuals who were dying an end-of-life vocabulary to conceptualize their end-of-life chapter. But what happened, I think many in Western society said, oh, great, this is how we grieve in general. So the expectation began that we would start out with denial, would progress to anger, would progress to bargaining. All of this would go in a linear fashion for a 6-month to 1 year period of time, which after that time we would bury our grief in a little box, put it aside, and move on as if nothing has happened. The reality is that grief is very circular. The raw pain of grief can come up at any time, depending on what's going on at that particular moment. I'll give you an example in my own journey. Jeannine was 18 years old when she transitioned. In the 17th year of her physical absence, I was beginning to experience grief as if it was like day one. I couldn't, I was having some physical pain. I was lethargic. I was irritated. And then as I sat back and reflected, and I also talked to another fellow traveler on a path that we never thought we'd be embracing. She said, you're coming up on the 18th year. That means your daughter will have been in spirit as long as she was alive. And that was a milestone that a lot of veteran grievers had gone through. And I hadn't understood that until I experienced that. So that's the example of circularity. It could just come up at any time. It's something as I've gotten older in grief, I've learned to expect. I've learned to look at that as just another part of the deal. That's one of the misconceptions. Grief is not linear, it's very circular. The other thing is, the other misconceptions I think about grief is that we are going to upset those individuals if we bring up that person's loved one. And in reality, it's the greatest gift when you've remembered and you want to talk about that loved one and you acknowledge their presence. You acknowledge that they have lived. That's the greatest gift to somebody. And the other thing with them, we're going to get into some gender specific stuff with men and with women. The other conception is that men don't feel their grief. What is true is that men feel grief. Most men feel grief. We just deal with grief differently. We feel feelings as intensely as our female counterparts. We've just been conditioned to deal with it differently. Women, it's been reinforced, and it's that they can emote, they can seek support. Men have a great deal of difficulty seeking support and directly emoting their emotions. But what men tend to do is work through their emotions. They tend to be active with that. If we're feeling upset, we distract ourselves from our emotions through doing activity. And the misconception is that men don't have feelings. What we do, we just express those. We just deal with them differently. And I think what I've told women in the past who have asked me, why is it that my men can't express emotions? Well, expressing emotions for men have with it some great risks. The risk of vulnerability, the risk of being seen as weak. And this is not for all men. Maybe 75% of the cases you might find this. And the other thing is with men is that, that men are do not like it when their women in their lives cry. Okay. In reality, a woman's tears represent symbolically what a man couldn't do, and that was protect their family. Every time I saw my wife crying, every time I saw my two sons in despair, it reminded me that at that time I failed as my job as a father, as I couldn't protect my daughter, I couldn't protect my family from what had happened, and that was a tremendous burden for me to carry until with the help of a lot of very supportive individuals, I realized that I had no control over a disease that was incurable. I had the illusion of control, but I didn't have control. And I realized that I did the best that I could given the circumstances that were dealt to me and given the hand of cards that were dealt to me. And the other thing is that, with all the questions I asked in the world, it was just very simply, in sacred law, it was my daughter's time to go. 18 years was enough for her soul to learn the lessons that she needed to learn in her physical body and then go after her new existence. In human law, 18 years wasn't enough. And it took me quite a while until I met Reverend Patty Farino. It took me quite a while to know the difference between human law and sacred law as it relates to an individual's death. And the answers or questions surrounding that.
Okay. Yeah, I totally get that. So with that, what could be some healthy coping mechanisms that you could recommend?
Wow. First of all, I like journaling. I think whether it's an audio journal that you keep or a written journal, I like journaling, particularly in the early phases. You can get all your feelings out uncensored. And it also gives you a written record of your progress as you continue to journal. I encourage individuals journaling when they feel the nudge to journal and to really keep it going, and then take a look at the progress that you've made. And even if you take 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, you're still 1 step ahead and you still made progress. But celebrate the progress that you've made. Journaling and a written record of that, or an audio record of that you can listen to or read, can be very powerful. The second thing, even in kind of the worst days of our lives, there's usually something good that will happen to us. And I encourage individuals to try to keep a gratitude journal in terms of just write down one thing a day that happened that you could be grateful for. So that's the other part. The other thing is support. Support in a community that will uplift you, that will validate your grief. So, for example, if it's an individual who has lost a husband or a wife, a spousal support group would be ideal, or even a general grief support group with a variety of different losses could work. Death of a child, I would find a bereaved parent support group, either through the Compassionate Friends or through the Bereaved Parents of the USA or through your local community. A lot of times funeral homes will sponsor those types of meetings. Read as much as you can, as much as you're capable of. The Open to Hope Foundation has some very good brief 500 to 1,000 word articles that, for individuals in early grief, that may be all they can process. The ability to concentrate increases. They can begin to read more and more, specifically memoirs of individuals who have transcended grief or other challenges. The other thing that I have found very helpful, and again, this is with the assistance of the conversations I had with Reverend Patty Farino, was transforming the relationship with my daughter by forming continuing bonds with her. The best parts of who my daughter are now integrated into who I am. So when you get me, you're going to get me, and you're going to get my daughter as well too. We have become a package deal. And symbolically, I've integrated my grief. I have carried my grief, and I've carried her with me. And that has given me peace. And don't get me wrong, there are days that I yearn for her physical presence, but those yearnings are temporary. I also understand that that's part of my permanent existence now. happiness, joy, sadness, confusion, anger, all of that are going to be a part of my existence. And in reality, it's a part of all of our existence, regardless of whether we've experienced loss or not. I don't know if I think I might have told you this in other conversations we've had. I don't hang around with happy people anymore. And I would encourage individuals in grief to hang around with genuine people, people who are going to be receptive to when they ask you how you're doing, and you tell them, boy, today really sucks. They're going to sit and create space for that. And I also tell individuals, don't ask a grieving person how they're doing unless you're prepared to spend some time with them, because they may need to talk, and this isn't just going to be like a courtesy social greeting. Yeah, I'm doing great. They may not be doing great, and you just can't say, well, I'll see you later. You need to be prepared to hold space for that. If you're not, don't ask the question. The other thing is, don't be afraid or fearful of painful emotions. We're meant to experience those emotions. Embrace it to the extent that you can. Learn from it. Learn that you can survive it. Learn that maybe in your worst moments of sadness, the most compassionate person could emerge from that. So try to take a look at the positives in the negatives as well too. Especially once you've distanced yourself from that. And expect that the worst loss that you've ever had in your life isn't going to be the only loss that you're going to have. There'll be, as long as we live, we're going to experience loss. I'm 69 years old now, and just because the worst loss I've experienced in my life is obviously Jeannine. However, I've experienced other losses as well too that have been traumatic for me as well. So expect that loss is going to be a part of life, and that our ability to lead a quality life is how we handle the challenges that are presented to us. And loss is going to be as much a part of our life as life itself.
I'm really glad you said that, because in my practice, I have come across endless people who use things like that as a reason as to why they actually cannot move forward. Is this really bad thing happened to me? I know I'm broken and I'll never ever be the same again, and there's nothing that I can do about it. I also try to stay away from what I like to call chronic new agers and positive mindset people, because sometimes they're actually the most unhappy, ungrateful people out there. They don't know how to deal with their issues, and so they're trying to love and light away or reframe everything that happens without actually taking a good, deep, genuinely honest look at what that could mean for them and what they need to do about it, who they could become, all those things. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of times people buy into this Western society mindset that happiness is the key to fulfillment. And happiness is a part of it. But I don't know anybody that's happy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, unless they're in total denial about the rest of their emotional experience, or they've so bought into this narrative that, geez, I can't have negative emotions in my life because it's going to interfere with productivity, which is why individuals get upset if people are grieving 6 months to a year, because you're interfering with that whole productivity narrative. You got to get better. I can't deal with that. But here's the thing: the second year is worse in many cases than the first year of grief. So you can throw that linear projection of grief right out the window. Because the second year for me, once 1 year and 1 day hit for me, the reality of the fact that my daughter was never coming back hit me. The first year I was thinking, she was going to appear down from heaven and just say, hey, Dad, just kidding. This was, I just took a vacation, or that God or whoever was in charge of the universe at that time was going to come down and say, we're going to give you your life back. We made a mistake. We're going to give you your life back the way you knew it. But that never happened, and it wasn't going to happen. But yet that first year, we kind of are in that between shock and surreal mode, where we're thinking that, well, maybe this was all a dream. But then when you hit that second year, you realize that this is reality now. So But I mean, for me, Debbie Ford wrote a book called The Dark Side of the Light Chasers, and she took off with Carl Jung's work with the shadow element. Carl Jung said the shadow is a person that you don't want to be. And I'm paraphrasing that. But she also talked about something very profound, saying that we are the microcosm of the macrocosm. We contain every emotion, good and bad, that's known to everybody in the universe, and that we can be in service to each other. And that a lot of times what we see in others are things we don't want to see in ourselves. But in order to develop genuineness, we need to be able to embrace that dark side, so to speak. We need to be able to make peace with it, to make friends with it, to allow us to teach us about ourselves and allow us to become whole and genuine. I think Friedrich Nietzsche, said something to the effect that if you deny your past, you're denying your existence. And a lot of the negative qualities that people don't want us to see a lot of it is based on decisions we made in our past. And our past basically is our teacher anyway. So to disown the past means that we're disowning a part of our existence that we can learn from. And for me, Jeannine, and for anybody with life-altering loss, I had to look at everything. All of my beliefs, all of my attitudes, all of my priorities. I had to take a look. That involved me taking a deep, dark look at my past. And, letting the past be my teacher and just saying, okay, based on the life that I've lived at the age of 47 when my daughter transitioned, what beliefs do I want to stay? Which beliefs do I want to expand? Which beliefs no longer serve me? So I went through kind of a death of a different sort, a death of those parts of me that no longer serve me in my new reality going forward.
Yeah. I'm just curious, what are some things that parents can do to help children process grief?
I think one is not shield them from it. I think, for me, and I've made this mistake as a parent, when my mother transitioned in 1994, my two kids at the time, because my son Matt wasn't born yet, she transitioned in 94, but my son Dan and Jeannine were very close to her. And what we did was we only allowed them to have a private showing, go to a private showing. We didn't give them the option to go to the funeral. We didn't give them the option to go to calling hours. We mistakenly thought we were shielding them. So one, don't shield your kids. Give them an opportunity to participate in a funeral to the extent that they want to. Maybe they want to make a card to put in the casket, or maybe they want to participate in picking out pictures or other memorabilia for a memory board, either digital or, just a cork board type of thing. Give them the opportunity. If they say no, that's okay. That you've given them the option. The other thing is, don't use euphemisms with that, especially with younger children. If you tell younger children that grandpa went away, literally they're going to ask you, when's he coming back? Or grandpa's sleeping. They may be afraid to go to sleep because they feel if he's sleeping, he's not waking up, they're not going to wake up. So, and there's a lot of good age-appropriate books out there to teach children about what happens when the body dies and the soul goes to heaven or whatever. There's a lot of good good age-appropriate books that can introduce children to death. And I think for parents, if they can model healthy grieving for their children, and particularly children at a young age, they're sensory motor, you're 2 or 6, they tend to imitate what their parents do. So if their parents are imitating healthy coping mechanisms of grief, whether it's, showing their emotions freely, reaching out for support, one, it's going to be, I think, a stabilizing influence for that child, and it's also going to model this is what we do during crisis. Also allow children to be as creative as they want. Kids will be creative through play. They'll through play therapy. They'll talk about different transitions that are going on in their house. For older children or adolescents who are creative, music, poetry, any type of poetry, literature, music that they're into can also be a vehicle for them expressing their emotions. Don't lie to children. Don't lie, especially about it. Just be as upfront with them as possible. As you know, and if there's information about a death that requires that is kind of ongoing, where I think particularly in mass shootings where information is always evolving. You tell individuals what they need to know at the present. You tell them what you don't know, and you tell them that as soon as we get updates, we'll let you know. Being honest, also normalizing the grief process. That crying is okay. That if you're having mood swings, it's normal. If you're feeling fatigued, it's normal. If you're constantly thinking about the person you've lost, that's normal. So between normalization, creating an open space for honest discussion, and not shielding children, giving them the option to participate in the funeral process as much as they wish to, or if not at all, at least give them that option and find age-appropriate ways to help them confront death and the realization of death.
Yeah, something happened with, my partner. I told you this last time we spoke. She just lost her grandfather. And for all intents and purposes, he was her father. So it's been a journey with that. But I've also taken note of how the various children spread out across the family have dealt with things. And one of the most interesting ones is that one of the little ones, she's only 2 years old. And she tells her mother she goes to the bedroom at night because she's going to play with Pap before she goes to bed. And so it kind of, it bothered them, but it didn't bother me or my partner hearing that, Also, like my partner's youngest child also, she has moments where she will look at his picture and just start crying and stuff like that. And, the best thing you can do is just let her go through the motions,
Mm-hmm.
So what were you going to say?
I was going to say that doesn't surprise me because children are highly intuitive between 3 and 7 anyway. And I think because of their alpha brainwave activities, they are the veil between this world and the afterlife or the other dimensions are non-existent. So they can readily communicate with loved ones, and they have that they're pure in heart and spirit. And the kids at that age aren't capable of lying anyway. There's another instance where I was working with a parent whose son died in a home accident, and his younger brother that he left behind, he'd be in the corner talking, and so she'd say, "Well, who are you talking to?" "I'm talking to my brother, and he has a message for you." So this is quite common. Kids, obviously they do imaginary play, but this is not imaginary play. This is a very specific conversation. I'm talking to Papa. I'm talking to Grandpa. I'm talking to Grandma. This is very specific. This goes beyond imaginary play. Kids can also have shared death experience, can participate in shared death experiences to an extent as well, too. And how this might happen. And I had another instance where one of my former students, their niece's uncle passed away. And the police came to, I think, her parents' store. Yeah, his parents' store, and she was there for to say that, and she looked up and said, "Is this about Uncle Brian?" And she knew he died before the rest of the family knew, and before the police communicated that. So what I think had happened is he left his spirit, he left his body, came to comfort her and said, "I'm always going to be with you," and took off to the other side. Now, shared death experiences, with near-death experiences, people will leave their bodies. They'll go to another dimension, which is the afterlife. They learn what they're supposed to learn, and then they're put back in their bodies to complete their life mission. And shared death experiences where the bystanders share in that experience, where they actually see the spirit leave the body, where they actually can sometimes even accompany the spirit of their deceased loved ones to the entrance of that dark tunnel, which immediately turns into light. So they can actually participate in that. It's got the same features as a near-death experience, but the bystanders have an opportunity to participate in that. This young girl probably had a witness, saw the spirit of her uncle who had left his body. She came to comfort her, and then he went off into another dimension. And so when kids, especially between the ages of 3 and 7, talk about these kind of things, they're very specific interactions that they've had that go beyond imaginary play.
Let's talk a bit about grief and its impact on mental health. A lot of people struggle with depression or anxiety as a result of grief. What can someone do to deal with that strange relationship between grief and poor mental health? And when should someone consider seeking professional help for that?
Well, first and foremost, one of the things I caution individuals on is confusing the normal sadness of grief with clinical depression. And a lot of times what happens, and this is a pet peeve of mine, is that the sadness of grief automatically will very soon after that person's transitioned or died or passed away, get diagnosed as major depression, and they're put on some type of SSRI, Zoloft, or Prozac, when really what is needed is just for them to work through the sadness of their grief through support, through other means. Now, it's not to say that the sadness of grief can't turn into depression. There's a couple of different instances where I think it can. One in instances of complicated grief where, all death is traumatic, but traumatic death may be due to suicide, homicide, mass shootings. If there is no movement from the raw pain of grief to eventually making a decision to re-engage in life with meaning and purpose in spite of what's happened, and that person stays stuck in the muck of grief, that sadness can definitely turn into depression. If an individual has had a prior diagnosis of clinical depression or anxiety, then mental health practitioners or coaches need to be mindful of reminding them to utilize the coping strategies that they've used to deal with their mental health and continue to do that, maybe continue to seek out additional support and augment that with additional support resources that can help them through grief. The other thing with anxiety, panic and fear is a normal emotional reaction, particularly the panic of losing more. If you're talking about a fear of losing more, if you're talking about a parent who's, like myself, who's experienced the death of a child, first thing that comes to our mind is that it can happen again, because that safety net, that illusion of safety and predictability was now shattered. And the reality is, if this happened to me once, this can happen to me twice, it can happen to me 3 times. So that in and of itself, that fear, we can either one of two things, that fear can paralyze us, or we could channel that fear productively to say that for however long I have in my life, or regardless of what happens, I'm going to live each day of my life to its fullest and be the best person I can possibly be to myself, to my family, and to those who need support from me. But a lot of times we put a pathological label on grief as I think the DSM-5R now has something that if the symptoms of grief don't subside after 2 weeks, then it's, we go to clinical depression, which to me is a bunch of hogwash. Because again, when you take a look at even Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, even society gave individuals 6 months to a year. The DSM-4 is going to give you 2 weeks. And then, the diagnosis with clinical depression puts you on medication. And that could be the worst thing, is to medicate grief, because a lot of times that can deaden the feeling of grief, and we need to feel it to go through it.
Yeah, I agree with you. What about grieving the loss of a pet?
I want to backtrack to one thing that you said about your significant other's grandfather, who she saw as a father. Here's the other thing that we need to understand. We grieve not only we have to honor the grief of how that person saw the relationship. It wasn't just a grandfather. She saw him as a father figure. That takes grief to a whole new level. It's losing a grandparent, which has its own set of grief that goes with it. And also losing somebody they have seen as a parent also has its own set of grief. And we need to honor that. We need to, as practitioners, find out what the relationship was. You could have two non-biological friends that see each other as brothers and sisters from different mothers. And if one of them die, they're going to look at that as not losing just a friend, but an adopted family member. And the depth of those relationships need to be honored. Death of a pet, a lot of times it becomes disenfranchised grief or grief that isn't honored because a lot of people say, oh, it's just a dog, it's just a cat. You can get another animal. Well, for individuals, couples, whether they're heteronormative couples, same-sex couples, if they're not going to have any kids or adopt any kids, their pets become part of their family. Their pets become as if they're their children, then they're objectified as their children. So they lose that. They lose a pet. They've lost a member, not only a member of their family, but one who they have been uniquely bonded to and will consider to be not only a member of their family, but one of their children. The other thing, if they're a service animal or an emotional support animal, the individual has now lost a part of their autonomy, a part of their independence, a part of their emotional comfort zone. That can't be replaced. So, I've transitioned. I've lost 7 pets in my life, Jeannine, and every one of them have had significance for me, particularly my daughter's cat, Bootsy, who after Jeannine transitioned, he would get me up at 4:30 in the morning, whether I wanted to or not, just to get me moving. And he showed me love, when I had trouble loving myself. So that cat, as my granddaughter, who, by the way, her and her significant other lived with us for 4 years after Jeannine transitioned. They had moved into us when she moved into our house when she got sick. But as Brianna got my wife Sherry moving, Bootsy got me moving. When he transitioned, it was a very traumatic time for me. Animals I think, are some of our greatest teachers. If you take a look at the Native American teachings of animals and nature, they consider animals to be revered. Animals were here long before we were. They consider their spirits to be precious, to be honored, and that they have a lot to teach us. And animals can teach us more about humanity than sometimes humans can. So, honor pet loss as you would any other loss. It's significant to the individuals going through it. Hold space for that. Hold stories for it. I have two of my cats' remains right up over my desk as I'm speaking to you. And one of them isn't Bootsy. Bootsy is in the backyard because he lived here for 21 years. But Zoe, who is another rescue cat that I inherited from my son, my oldest son, was a cat who just showed me, maybe would make me laugh out loud. And that part of me had died a little bit after Jeannine passed. But she would just do like really, fun stuff, fun things, and just make me laugh and bring joy in my life. So, but yeah, pet loss can be disenfranchised, but don't let it be. Honor it and treat it as loss as any significant as human loss.
Okay, well, Dave, I think we are coming up to the end of the hour. Let's move on to our final thoughts. What is one key takeaway that you'd like for the listeners to remember about grief?
Well, first of all, this is a term that's always probably been used and overused. Grief is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Progress is not linear, but progress will be made. As I mentioned earlier, if you take 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, you're still 1 step ahead. Show grace to yourself. Give up any sense of control you thought you had, because control is simply just an illusion. The only control we have is the control of how we react to things, how we treat ourselves, how we treat our loved ones, and how we choose to transcend challenge. Show grace to yourself. Be gentle with yourself. Don't hesitate to ask for help and support. And I will leave you with a quote from one of my favorite musicians and drummers of all time, Neil Peart. This is from his book, Ghost Rider Travels on a Healing Road. We are all islands to each other, building hopeful bridges on the troubled seas. And so let's be islands to each other during time of challenge, and let's build those bridges between us so we can help each other through challenging times.
I like it. Well, Dave, it's been really awesome talking with you. And I think that this is a subject that many people need to have your level of insight on. Can you tell us where we can find you?
Well, you can find me. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Instagram. You can also go to my website, davidrobertsmsw.com. It has my contact information there. If you want to go to my author page, mine and Reverend Patty Farino's author page, it's psychologyprofessorandminister.com. You'll see some reviews about the book. You'll see some blog postings as well, some other reviews that were not on Amazon for the book, and a way to purchase the book. And for those who want to know more about my continued transformation from grief, this book lays it all out. There's nothing you won't know about me in this book. I'm very transparent with my journey, transparent with the conversations I had with Reverend Farino, and how she was instrumental in helping me integrate both spirituality and psychology to gain a better understanding of myself and the world. And how she taught me how to transform the relationship with my daughter too. So I have an ongoing relationship with her in spirit. So that's how you can get in touch with me. And also, if you want, one more thing, if you want to listen to the Teaching Journeys podcast, our episode with me and Jeannine will be coming out very soon. You can find it on any major podcast platform, Apple, Spotify. So feel free to check it out. And we also have it on YouTube as well too. So that's how you can find me, find out what I'm doing, and connect with me.
Okay. Well, Dave, thanks for being on the Boundless Authenticity podcast.
I love the name because I only have people in my circle now with boundless authenticity.
All right, Dave. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jeannine. It was great talking with you.